This segment of Ask GHCC, we're going to look at the question, why should I read the Old Testament? And I think this is an important question because a lot of Christians don't really understand how they're to relate to the Old Testament or how they're to read it or what it really means for them. And so for us, in order to answer that question, what I want to do is I want to start out with asking the question, what did Jesus think about the Old Testament? How did he view it? And in Luke 24, we're given this really great insight into the way that Jesus saw the Old Testament. Namely, that he saw the Old Testament as being fulfilled in him, that all of the Old Testament was pointing towards him, both in his person and in what he was going to do when he came. And so what I want to do is talk about the meta-narrative, talk about the storyline of the Bible and how the Old Testament fits into that and what Jesus saw in the Old Testament. So beginning in Genesis chapter 1, we're introduced to the major characters in our storyline of the Bible, God, and then the creation that he made from nothing, which comes to its climax in the making of humanity, where Adam is made in the image of God, and then also Eve comes, and they're equal. And then we see in Genesis chapter 2 that they live in a garden, and it's perfect, and they have perfect relationship with God. They have perfect relationship with one another. There's perfect relationship with themselves and also with the creation around them. But then all of a sudden in Genesis chapter 3, we're introduced to evil and sin and the serpent, which ultimately tempts Adam and Eve, and they fall. And now sin is introduced, and now we have an adversary in this storyline. But in the fall, there's something interesting that happens. In Genesis chapter 3, God curses Satan, he curses Adam, he curses Eve. But I want to focus on the cursing of Satan, the serpent. There's something that is said, that God says, actually, it's a promise. He said that there will be an offspring of the serpent and there will be an offspring of the woman, and they will have enmity between one another. But in the end, the offspring of the woman will crush the head of the offspring of the serpent. And so right from the beginning, God gives this promise that there will come someone someday who will be the offspring of a woman, who will be the seed of the woman, who will ultimately be the serpent crusher. He will be the one that is victorious over sin, that is victorious over evil, that is victorious over Satan himself. And so really from that point forward, we as the readers are really asking the question, who is he? Who is the serpent crusher? Who is the promised offspring? Who is the seed that will be born of a woman that will conquer? And so throughout the Old Testament, we're introduced to many different narratives and many different characters and many different things that are happening. Each of them is adding to answer the question, who is the serpent crusher? And so we're introduced to people like Abraham, who God enters into a covenant with. And we ask the question, is he the one? And he's not the one, but it's through him. And then we're introduced to Moses. Is it Moses that's going to be the serpent crusher that will overcome? Well, he delivers the people, but he's not the one either. Abraham, as we see, ends up being the father of many nations, and Moses is the one that helps establish the nation. And then comes a major character, David. And we ask the question, is David the one? And it's not David either. God enters into another covenant, same covenant, but in a different aspect, with David. And David becomes this great king and is made a promise in 2 Samuel 7 that there'll come another king whose kingdom will reign forever. It'll be an everlasting kingdom, and he'll reign eternally. And so we're asked the question, well, could it be David? And it's not David. It's not Solomon who comes after him. It's always projecting forward to the one who will be the king, the one who will conquer sin and evil, Satan himself, the serpent crusher. And then what's interesting is when we look at the prophets, many times they are unfolding for us what God is doing in redemptive history, that the prophets are looking forward to the day of the Messiah, when he will come and he will establish justice and he will rule the nations, and God will pour out his grace and mercy on those who have faith. And what's interesting is Galatians 4 actually looks at Jesus as being the fulfillment of the promise of that serpent crusher. Galatians 4:4 says that in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, and that we would receive adoption as sons. And so what Paul's doing in the book of Galatians is getting us to remember the Old Testament and remember Genesis 3:15, that there will come a seed, there will come an offspring born of a woman who will conquer. And in the fullness of time and God's perfect plan, that offspring and that seed, that serpent crusher, his name is Jesus. He was born under the law, born of a woman, to redeem those who are under the law and under the curse of sin. And so what we see through Paul's writings is a continual look backwards, that Jesus is undoing the curse. He's reversing it. So where there's sin, there will be sin no more because of Jesus and what he's done. Where there is death, instead, because of what Jesus has done, there will be life. And so it's important for us as Christians to read the Old Testament because it fills out for us the context of the New Testament. We get a clearer picture of just the magnitude of what Jesus has done. And we get an idea of just how important the person of Jesus really is. That he is the fulfillment of all the promises of God. That ultimately he is the serpent crusher. He's the one that's victorious over sin, victorious over death, victorious over Satan and evil itself. He is the fulfillment of that promise of the offspring and the seed. And so as we read the Old Testament, we really see how the prophets and the nation of Israel itself really is bringing us forward in anticipation and preparation for the person of Jesus, who would conquer through the cross and through the resurrection to accomplish all that God had promised, namely victory and freedom and life. And so that's why I think it's really important for us to read the Old Testament, and why us as Christians, we would do well to spend more time in the Old Testament, because we will get a fuller and richer understanding of who Christ is and all the benefits that he purchased for us on the cross.